All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to explore a really remarkable piece of philosophy from the early 20th century. Our source is a chapter from the Treatise on Nature by the Islamic scholar Bediüzzaman Said Nursi. Now, this text builds a purely logical case for a massive idea, and we're going to break down the very first part of that argument, step by step. So let's get right into it.
So, right out of the gate, the author doesn't start with a statement. He starts with a question, one that he pulls directly from the Quran. And this isn't just some throwaway opening line. This question is the frame for his entire argument. You see, the verse implies that a creator's existence is just self-evident. The rest of the treatise is his detailed attempt to show you, through pure logic, why he believes there shouldn't be any doubt.
So how in the world does he try to do that? Well, here's the interesting part. Not through faith alone, but by building a case, a real case using pure reason. We're going to follow his footsteps here on a kind of journey of logical elimination and see exactly how he gets to his conclusion. It's a really fascinating process.
Okay, so what's this all really about? It boils down to one of the biggest questions there is, the mystery of existence itself. I mean, we look around and we see all this intricate, beautiful life constantly being renewed. The treatise starts from a really simple place. Any rational worldview it must have an answer for where all of this comes from. This is the starting block for the entire logical framework he's about to build.
And this is where his method gets really clear. He structures the entire problem by proposing that, when you think about it rationally, there are only four possible answers to that question of existence. So, either things are created by the material causes we see around us, the elements and forces, or they somehow just create themselves, or they're made by that abstract idea we call nature, or finally they're created by a single, all-powerful creator. His whole method is to go down each path one by one to see which one actually holds up to logical scrutiny.
So for our purposes today, we're going to zero in on his analysis of that very first path, the idea that causes create. This is the proposition that all the physical stuff in the universe, the elements, the forces, what we'd call material causes, that they are what bring living things into existence. The author's claim is that this path is logically impossible, that it's blocked by what he calls impossibilities.
The author's first major challenge to this idea is what he calls the first impossibility. And to make his point, he uses this really powerful analogy he calls the universal pharmacy.
Okay, so imagine this, a vast pharmacy filled with hundreds, maybe thousands of jars, and each one has a different substance inside. Now, our job is to create a very specific living potion. And the recipe for it is incredibly precise. You need exactly 1 ounce from this jar over here, 3 from that one, maybe 7 from another one way in the back. The formula is so unbelievably sensitive that if you add even a single drop too much or too little from any of those jars, the whole thing is ruined. It won't have life.
So this leads us to the big question of the analogy. Is it even remotely possible that some random accident, let's say a sudden earthquake or a gust of wind, could shake all of those jars in just the perfect way, so that the exact amounts needed spill out, mix together perfectly, and form that living potion? All by chance?
And the author's conclusion to this little thought experiment is, well, it's pretty vivid. He writes that even an animal, an ass in his words, if it could somehow understand the concept, would immediately recognize how completely absurd that idea is and just reject it. It's a bit of humor for sure, but he's making a deadly serious point about sheer statistical impossibility.
And that right there is the whole point of the analogy. He's arguing that every single living being is just like that incredibly complex potion. It's made of countless different elements, all drawn from this vast pharmacy of the universe, and they're all combined in unbelievably precise measures. So to claim this just happens by the random collision of causes, he says, is just as illogical as that crazy story about the accident in the pharmacy.
All right, that was the first one. The second impossibility kind of shifts gears. If the first one was all about precision, this next one is about scale and complexity. And for this, the author asks us to think about something really small and common, a fly.
What he does here is set up this incredible contrast. On one side of the scale, you have the tiny body of a fly, which he describes as a kind of summary, a microcosm of the entire universe, because it contains elements from all over creation. And then on the other side, you have the vast, sprawling universe of material causes, all the different, opposing, and often clashing forces that exist out there.
And this leads to a conclusion that he argues is just, well, completely absurd.
If material causes are the real creators, and a cause has to be present to have an effect, then all those different causes from all across the universe would somehow have to gather together and be physically present inside the tiny body of that fly, all working in perfect harmony inside every single one of its microscopic cells.
Okay, so that brings us to the third and final impossibility he lays out in this chapter. And this one deals with the idea of unity, the wholeness, and the integrated order that we see in every living thing.
So when he says unity, what are we actually talking about? Well, it's the idea that a living being isn't just a random pile of parts. It's a single cohesive system, a whole, where every single component works together in perfect balance and order, all to serve a single purpose. And again, he sets up this powerful comparison. A being that has such profound unity, he argues, has to logically point to a single, unifying source, one hand that is wise and has a purpose. To say that that same perfect order comes from innumerable, chaotic, and conflicting causes, many hands that are blind and are often working against each other, that would logically only create confusion and conflict, not the seamless, perfect unity we actually see. And he doesn't stop there. He takes this point one step further, drawing a sharp line between a being's outside and its inside. He argues that material causes, things like wind, water, chemicals, they can only act on the exterior of a creature. And yet, the art and the order inside a living being are even more intricate, even more delicate. So the treatise asks, how could these external, crude, blind forces possibly create the microscopic, perfect art that's found deep within a being, in places they can't even reach?
So there you have it. 3 distinct, major logical roadblocks that the treatise puts up against the idea that material causes create life. You've got the impossibility of the universal pharmacy, which deals with precision. You've got the problem of the fly, which addresses scale and complexity. And finally, the question of unity, which focuses on order and purpose.
So, according to the author's line of reasoning, these 3 impossibilities are enough to completely shut down the first of the 4 possible paths. He believes he's shown, just with reason, that causes cannot be the creators. And this, of course, leaves us with a pretty big question. If this path is blocked, if it's a dead end, then what about the other 3? And that's the bigger journey this text invites you on, leaving you to wonder where the logic might take you next.
All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're really digging into a pretty massive idea from a text called the Treatise on Nature. And it asks a question that seems simple on the surface, but it's one that gets right to the very heart of, well, everything. So the whole idea the author wants to put to the test is this. Could something as incredibly complex as a living being just form itself, out of nothing with no instructions, no designer, no guide? It's a huge question, so let's see how the author takes it apart.
Okay, so this is the theory we're looking at. But here's the thing. The author doesn't just treat it like some abstract possibility. He argues that this claim is absolutely loaded with what he calls many impossibilities. That's a pretty bold way to frame it, and he's about to lay out his case, piece by piece.
So how does he actually go about challenging this? Well, he uses 3 really powerful thought experiments, and he calls them 3 impossibilities that are specifically designed to show why this whole premise just doesn't add up. Let's walk through them together. The first impossibility starts by zooming way in, down to the smallest possible scale. The author asks us to seriously consider the individual particles that make up our own bodies. What would they actually need to be capable of to pull this off, all on their own?
So first, the text gives us this incredible image of the human body. It's not just some static collection of stuff, right? It's a wonderful palace that's always in motion, a machine where particles are constantly at work, building, rebuilding, renewing.
And this leads us to the critical question. If there's no master plan, if every single particle is its own boss, what would it have to know to do its job perfectly inside this unbelievably complex system?
And the implications here, they're just staggering. The author argues that for this to work, every single particle would basically have to be a super genius. It would need to know the entire blueprint of your body, your whole genetic history, its connection to the entire cosmos, and even where your food is coming from. I mean, just pause and think about that. All of that information packed into a single tiny particle.
The author's conclusion on this point is, let's say, pretty blunt. He argues that believing a single non-conscious particle has this kind of godlike knowledge is, in his own words, a crazy superstition 1,000 times over. Okay, so that was the problem of knowledge. The second impossibility comes at this from a totally different angle.
Logic. And to make his point, the author brings back that amazing metaphor of the body as a magnificent, self-repairing palace.
I mean, really try to visualize this. A palace where the stones aren't held together by mortar or anything. They're just floating in perfect balance. And not only that, but every single stone is constantly being replaced by a new one, yet the palace itself remains perfectly whole. That's the image of the body he presents.
Now, this is where the paradox really hits you. The author argues that if there's no architect, then every single particle has to be two completely opposite things at the exact same time. It must be the absolute ruler, dominant over everything else, while also being completely submissive and obedient. It has to be both the master and the servant, both equal and opposed, a source of power and totally restricted. It's a flat-out logical contradiction.
So, this right here is the heart of the second argument. For this whole self-forming system to work, every single part would have to exist in a state of logical paradox. The author concludes this is an obvious impossibility for anyone with even, and I'm quoting here, a particle of consciousness.
Okay, on to the third and final argument. This one tackles the problem from yet another angle, causality, and it uses a really clever analogy that involves a printing press.
So the logic goes something like this. Imagine you want to create a book, but you don't have an author who knows the story and is holding a single pen. How would you do it? Well, you'd need a totally different system. You'd need a printing press.
And here's the crucial difference. A single pen works because of the knowledge in the writer's mind. A printing press, on the other hand, it replaces that one knowledgeable source with a huge number of simple, pre-made tools, a separate physical block for every single letter.
And here is the punchline. When you apply this idea to a living being, the author says it creates this impossible situation called an infinite regress. To print a body, you would need countless molds for every single cell, but then you'd need tools to make those molds, and then more tools to make those tools, and the chain of causes would just stretch backwards forever. It's a process that could never actually begin.
So, we've walked through these three arguments, these three alleged impossibilities. What's the final takeaway? What does it all add up to from the author's point of view?
So really, what we've seen here is a systematic breakdown of the idea that things just form themselves. The author's argument is that this theory completely crumbles when you look at it closely. It demands impossible knowledge from particles, it requires them to exist in a state of logical contradiction, and it depends on an infinite chain of causes that could never get started. But the text doesn't just tear one idea down and leave us with nothing. By trying to prove that one path is impossible, the author is implicitly pointing us toward another possibility. And the argument leaves us right here, with this really powerful, really provocative question. If it can't be this, then what?
All right, welcome. Today we're diving into a really fascinating philosophical argument from Sayyid Nursi's Treatise on Nature. It's basically a step-by-step logical test of one single powerful idea. So, let's see how it all unfolds.
Okay, so the entire argument really hinges on this one simple phrase, the idea that nature itself is the ultimate cause of everything. The author basically puts this idea on trial, you could say, to see if it holds up logically.
So how does he do it? Well, he builds his case by laying out what he calls three impossibilities. These are three lines of reasoning that are designed to show that this whole idea of nature as creator, well, that it just doesn't add up. Let's dig into the first one.
So this first point is all about scale and source. It kind of poses the question, if all the incredible art and design we see in the universe comes from something that's described as blind and unthinking, like nature, what does that actually imply? What do we have to believe for that to be true?
And to explain this, the argument uses this really powerful analogy. Get this. Imagine the sun reflecting in a million tiny shards of glass on the ground. It's pretty logical, right? All those little bright spots come from the one single sun up in the sky. But if you deny that single source, you're forced to believe something totally absurd. That a tiny, real, physical sun exists inside every single one of those little glass fragments.
Okay, so that same logic is then applied to creation itself. If you take away the idea of one single creator, the one sun in our analogy, then every single being, we're talking even a fly, has to contain within itself the infinite power and the infinite knowledge to create the entire universe. I mean, the author presents this as a complete impossibility.
And the author's conclusion on this point is, well, it's blunt. He calls this idea a superstition. He's saying it's a leap of faith into an absurdity that's way greater than anything else you could imagine.
All right, on to the second impossibility. This one kind of zooms in, shifting from this big universal picture to a very local one. It questions the kind of power nature would need to have in one specific place at one specific time.
So the author asks us to just think about a simple pot of soil. You've got the same basic elements in there, dirt, water, air, and yet from that same simple stuff, it can produce countless, totally different and incredibly artistic flowers. The question is, how?
Well, if nature is the cause, the text argues that that little pot of soil must contain, get this, immaterial, miniature printing presses and factories. And not just a few. We're talking one for every single possible type of flower, each with its own unique blueprint. It's an incredible claim.
And this point is illustrated with another great analogy. The soldier analogy. Think about it. A single soldier who's connected to his king's army can do mighty things, right? He's tapping into the army's power. But what happens if you sever that connection? Now, to do the exact same job, he'd have to carry the entire army's arsenal on his own back. It's an impossible burden. So, the takeaway here is pretty clear. Attributing creation to one creator is simple and easy, like that connected soldier. But attributing it all to nature? Well, that makes every single object impossibly complex and burdened, just like that poor soldier trying to carry a whole army's worth of gear.
Okay, let's move on to the third and final impossibility. This one argues that there's a really fundamental mistake being made here, and basically it's about mistaking the blueprint for the builder.
So the text tells this little story. Imagine a man, described as a wild savage, who stumbles upon a magnificent palace in the middle of a desert. He can't see a builder anywhere, but inside he finds the notebook with all the architectural plans. And what does he conclude? He illogically decides that the notebook itself must have built the palace. And this is the exact mistake the author accuses the naturalist of making. They see the notebook of universal laws, what we call nature, and they confuse the programmer with the programmer, the blueprint with the builder.
Yeah, the author's response here is not subtle at all. It's a direct, almost desperate plea to look beyond the physical swamp of nature, to see the source of its very laws.
And one last analogy really drives this point home. Imagine someone watching an army drill in perfect formation. If they can't even conceive of a commander giving invisible orders, they might just assume the soldiers are being moved by invisible strings. The author says the naturalist does the exact same thing, mistaking the invisible laws of a lawgiver for a physical force called nature.
So, after systematically arguing that all these other explanations are just impossible, the author then presents what he frames as the only logical option left on the table. So what is nature then, according to this perspective? Well, it's not the creator, it's the creation. It's a work of art, but it's not the artist. It's a passive set of laws, not the active lawgiver who put them all into place in the first place. And because all the other options have been argued one by one to be impossible, this conclusion is presented as the only one that remains. The whole argument is really a process of elimination. You remove what's absurd, and whatever is left must be the truth. Now, to really seal his case, the author leaves us with two final, powerful questions. First, what's easier, for a watchmaker to make all the cogs and assemble a clock, or for him to build a tiny, wonderful little machine inside each and every cog to do the job for him? And the second question follows the same logic. Is it easier for a scribe to just write a book, or to invent some kind of magical ink and paper that writes the book all by itself? You see, both questions frame the naturalist view as choosing a path that is 100 times more complex and difficult. And really, that's the core of the argument. It's not an appeal to faith, not an appeal to emotion, but a direct logical challenge. After laying out all the options, it throws down this logical gauntlet, and ultimately leaves the final verdict up to you. Welcome, everyone. In this explainer, we're going to dive deep into some really profound questions about creation, about worship, and the very nature of existence itself. And we're doing it all through the lens of the 4th chapter of Sayyid Nursi's Treatise on Nature. Okay, so let's kick things off with a question that gets right to the heart of things. And it's one a lot of us have probably thought about. You might believe God is the ultimate creator of everything, but what about the small stuff? Can't natural causes, minor causes, have a hand in the day-to-day details? Does it really matter if nature handles the little things? So to get our heads around this, the treatise doesn't start with complex physics, but with a really powerful and simple idea from our own world, the nature of rulership and sovereignty.
The logic here is surprisingly straightforward, but it's the foundation for everything that follows.
I mean, think about it for a second. In our own world, even a village headman doesn't want someone else interfering in his business. And two kings trying to rule one kingdom, that's a recipe for disaster, for chaos. The argument is, if a flawed human ruler is that jealous of their tiny bit of power, just imagine how absolute and indivisible the sovereignty of a perfect, divine creator must be.
And that's the whole point. Absolute sovereignty, by its very nature, can't have interference. It can't have partners or participants. It has to be total. So if a human king is willing to go to war to protect his fragile little kingdom, it just makes sense that an all-powerful creator's authority would be infinitely more absolute, completely indivisible.
Okay, so this whole idea of absolute authority, it naturally brings up another huge and very personal question. If God is all-powerful, if he's totally self-sufficient and needs absolutely nothing from us, then why does he command us to worship him?
You can see why this feels like a puzzle, right? Why would a being that needs nothing demand anything from us? Well, the answer we get here completely flips that question on its head. It reframes the entire purpose of worship.
And the answer is incredibly simple. He doesn't need our worship at all. It's the other way around. We are the ones who are spiritually sick, who have these spiritual wounds, and worship? Well, worship is the cure. The analogy used to explain this is just brilliant. It's like a compassionate doctor. If a doctor prescribes you some life-saving medicine and insists that you take it, you don't turn around and ask, "Doctor, what do you get out of me taking this?" Of course not. You know the command, the insistence is for your benefit. And in the same way, the command to worship is presented here not as a demand for God, but as a merciful prescription for our own spiritual health.
So when you look at it this way, abandoning worship isn't just a personal choice with no consequences. It's seen as a kind of injustice on so many levels. It's an injustice to all of creation because you're essentially denying its higher purpose. And it's an injustice to your own soul because you're denying it the very medicine it needs to heal.
All right, now we get to a really fascinating part, something that at first feels like a total paradox. When you look at the universe, it's infinitely complex, right? So how could it possibly be created with such boundless, effortless ease? The answer lies in one incredibly powerful principle.
And the secret, the key to unlocking this whole thing is unity. Think about this. If creation comes from one maker, then creating the entire universe is just as easy as creating a single flower. But if you try to say it comes from a multitude of different, separate causes, that's multiplicity. Then creating even one tiny fly becomes impossibly difficult. You need the entire universe to come together and cooperate just to make that one little being.
So how is this incredible ease possible? Well, it's explained as a two-step process. First, you have divine knowledge, which acts like a perfect scientific formula or a blueprint. The model for everything is already determined. And then divine power simply comes in and brings that model to life. It's not about struggling to invent something new each time. It's about flawlessly executing a perfect pre-existing plan.
And you know, this isn't just a philosophical idea. It's right there in the Quran. This verse, for example, says that for the Creator, creating and resurrecting all of humankind is as simple as doing it for just one person. The scale of the task just doesn't matter when the power is absolute and the source is one. It makes no difference.
So, let's tackle the final hurdle, the big one. This is a classic philosophical argument that's been around for ages, and the treatise confronts it head-on. Here's the objection. Nothing can be created from nothing. The idea is that things aren't really created, they're just rearranged. Matter is eternal, and what we see is just endless combination and decomposition. But this very belief actually pushed those who deny a creator into a really tight logical corner.
See, if you go down that road, and you don't have a creator who can bring things into being from nothing, you end up stuck between a rock and a hard place. You either have to deny that reality itself even exists, or you have to deny the very act of creation and just say everything is random particles bumping into each other by chance.
So what's the answer from this perspective? It's that a truly all-powerful creator isn't bound by our rules. Creation happens in two ways. The first way is called origination. This is bringing a being into existence with all of its necessary parts from absolute nothingness, ex nihilo. And then there's the second method, composition. This is where the creator acts like a master artist, skillfully assembling new beings from the elements that already exist in the universe. It's this beautiful, deliberate process that is meant to display his wisdom and his names.
And after working through all of this, from sovereignty to worship to the secrets of creation, the questioner in the text, the one who started with all these doubts, finally gets to a place of complete and total certainty. All the doubts are just gone, replaced by clarity and gratitude.
So this whole journey, from a place of deep doubt to one of firm belief, leaves us with one last, really powerful thought to ponder. If this vast, incredibly intricate universe is a reflection of its creator, and if it's all brought into being with such profound, effortless ease, what does that tell us about what true power really is? It suggests a power so absolute that it operates completely beyond the struggles and limitations that define our own world.
Welcome. We're about to walk through a really powerful philosophical argument. It's a journey that uses pure logic to tackle one of the biggest, most fundamental questions you could ever ask.
And this is it. This is where the text we're exploring, Said Nursi's Treatise on Nature, begins. How does anything exist at all? You know, it's a question that whispers in the back of our minds, whether we're looking at the stars or just thinking about life itself.
So, how in the world do you even begin to answer a question that massive? Well, the approach here isn't about just taking someone's word for it. It's built on a foundation of strict, step-by-step logic. Think of it like a detective's process of elimination, examining every possibility until only one logical answer is left.
Now, according to the treatise, reason tells us there are really only 4 potential explanations for existence. Anything and everything that exists has to fall under one of these 4 paths. So our job here is to put the first 3 under the microscope and see if they actually hold up.
Okay, let's start with path number 1. This one probably sounds the most familiar to many of us. It's the idea that things, and especially living things, are just the result of different causes in the universe coming together. You know, the right stuff in the right place at the right time.
To really put this idea to the test, the text gives us this incredible thought experiment. I want you to picture a pharmacy. But this isn't just any old pharmacy. It's a cosmic one, containing every single element and ingredient in the entire universe.
And inside this pharmacy, our goal is to create a living potion. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. This isn't just about mixing things together. It's a formula that requires absolute, breathtaking precision. We're talking exact measurements from hundreds of different jars, and if you're off by even a single drop, the whole thing fails. Life just doesn't happen.
So this brings us to the crucial question. Imagine some chaotic event, maybe an earthquake or a storm, that sends every single one of those jars crashing down from the shelves. Is it even remotely believable that in all that chaos, the exact, perfect amounts needed for that one living formula would just happen to pool together by pure, dumb luck?
Well, the text conclusion is, let's just say, pretty blunt. The argument here is that believing the incredible complexity of a living being came from a random collision of causes is infinitely more absurd than our potion forming by accident. And just like that, the first path is dismissed as a logical dead end.
All right, so if a random combination of external causes doesn't work, what's next? This brings us to path number 2, the idea that things simply create themselves, that a being, say a human, is somehow its own creator.
To really get our heads around this, we get another beautiful analogy. The human body isn't seen as just a collection of parts, it's imagined as this magnificent, 1,000-domed palace, a structure of unbelievable order and beauty that is constantly, perfectly rebuilding and renewing itself from within.
And this is where the whole idea of self-creation runs into a huge problem. If the body builds itself, then every single tiny particle it's made of, these simple, blind bits of matter, must somehow possess an impossible level of intelligence. Each one would have to know its job, its exact location, and how to work with trillions of other particles.
Just think about that for a second. For this path to be true, it would mean that every single atom in your body would need to be a super genius architect, a brilliant planner, all working in perfect harmony. The treatise concludes, this is just another fantasy, a complete logical impossibility.
So, with the first 2 paths ruled out, we come to the third one. And this is a big one, maybe the most common explanation of all. The idea that some abstract force we call nature is the creator.
To explore this, we're told a little story. Imagine a man, someone who knows nothing about building, wandering through the desert. He stumbles upon a perfectly constructed, magnificent palace. He goes inside, looks everywhere, but finds no one. The only thing he finds is a notebook, and inside are all the blueprints and rules for how the palace was built. He looks at the book, looks at the palace, and concludes, the book must have built this place.
And that, right there, is the treatise's definition of nature. Nature isn't the builder, it's the notebook. It's the set of laws, the blueprint, the description of how the palace is made. It can describe creation perfectly, but it has zero power to actually do the creating.
This distinction is absolutely central to the whole argument. Nature is the artwork, not the artist. It's the beautifully stitched embroidery, not the embroiderer. It's the body of laws, but not the lawgiver who put them into effect. You see? In every case, nature is presented as the passive result, not the active source of creation.
So, the final conclusion here is that saying nature creates things is just as illogical as saying that a book of blueprints can build a palace. The blueprints are crucial, for sure, but they don't have any power on their own to lift a single stone.
So here we are, after this careful, systematic process, after looking at creation by causes, creation by self, and creation by nature, and finding all of them to be logically impossible, we are left with only one path still standing.
And this is the heart of the proof. If the first three ways are shown to be, well, absurd from a logical standpoint, then the fourth way isn't just one more option on the list. It's presented as the necessary conclusion, the only one that makes rational sense.
And this is that fourth and final path, the way of unity. It's the conclusion that every single thing, from the tiniest particle to the grandest galaxy, comes into being directly, purposefully, from the power of a single, all-knowing, all-powerful creator.
And the whole argument really leaves us with this final thought, a question to really chew on. What's easier? What's more logical? For a single watchmaker to design and assemble a clock? Or for that watchmaker to have to create a tiny, unbelievably complex machine inside every single cog so they can all build the clock themselves? It's a powerful challenge to weigh the logic of unity against what the treatise presents as the layers of impossibility in all the other paths.